Welcome to Superhero Rundown. I'm Crimson, and today we are venturing past the series we here in the United States know and love, and are going to Australia to explore Aboriginal culture in the series Cleverman. I don't know that much about the indigenous cultures of Australia, so if I'm being racist without meaning to, I apologize, and please correct me. I am going based off the show and its creator, who is indigenous. If you're white, shut up. This isn't your culture, and don't white-splain at me how you know better than the culture itself. I said what I said. Have a nice day. And now, a short history of Indigenous Australians as told by Wikipedia. First, the term Aboriginal Australians includes many regional groups who have a local language, local customs, and where community is especially important. And this does feature heavily in Cleverman itself, as the series does take some liberties, but is grounded in respect. The first humans in Australia date to 49,000 years ago. Before European contact, they were foragers and hunter-gatherers, being mobile and semi-nomadic based on food availability, not just based on land, but also by sea. When the British arrived in 1788, the indigenous people had already been around for thousands of years. They brought smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. In 1789, there was a smallpox epidemic that killed 90% of the Daru people, although white historians say that it might have been something else. Sure, Jan. Anyway, there were wars and genocide, because no white colonization is complete without genocide. Children were stolen, and by 1900, the recorded indigenous population was only 93,000 people. But some progress has happened. On February 13, 2008, the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, issued a formal apology to the Indigenous peoples on behalf of the federal government of Australia, and they are organizing to have a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution. And this is the backdrop of where we find Cleverman. The story revolves around two half-brothers, Waru and Cohen West. The story also revolves around the politics of the Hairy people, who are used by the government and the leaders of their communities for their own personal gain. You know, like an apartheid state. Now, I'm not going to break this down point by point, because I don't want to ruin everything about the story, but I will say that it's a great series and worth the watch, even though it's only 12 episodes and deserved more. The Hairy people cannot live freely out in the open, and shaving is very demeaning for them. But I'm going to focus on the catalyst of the series, and Waru and Cohen for the most part here. The story begins with Cohen housing a family of hairy people, then tipping off the authorities. This leads to the killing of one of them, a young girl named Jira, and everyone sees it live. Slade, played by the guy who was friend-zoned by Khaleesi in Game of Thrones, runs a television network and manipulates everyone around him to find the Dreaming, which is an Aboriginal cultural touchpoint I know nothing about, so I'm not going to make assumptions. You know, like an entire asshole. The survivors of the shooting really highlight what minorities go through: prison, brothel slavery, being ousted from your home, and being ID'd to leave a place, among other things. You know, apartheid. Cohen runs a bar while Waru runs the Zone, where hairy people and regular non-hairy people live peacefully. After the shooting, Cohen receives the Nulla Nulla, an Aboriginal hard club from Uncle Jimmy, and becomes the new Cleverman, leaving Waru extremely jealous as he thought he would be Jimmy's successor. The Cleverman cannot die by normal means, so Cohen has to learn the rituals of his people to protect them, and the first 6 episodes show an uncertain protagonist who doesn't know how to use his powers. It's actually refreshing to see a hero not know what to do right away. By the end of the first episode of Flash, Barry had a lot to learn, but unlike Cohen, he could use his basic powers. Cohen doesn't have that luxury, and it's a wonderful slow burn of a series. The surrounding characters do a lot to shape the world: brothels, racism, ID checks, and more. It also shows that the surrounding characters are mostly okay with it, which just proves that most people would just either ignore it or acquiesce and let bad things keep happening. We learn that hairy people have been out for 6 months after what the media calls Emergence Day. The other reason this is so good? It shows the world from the perspective of hairy people, non-hairy people, and those in charge. You see the horror endured by the hairy people. The demeaning shaves, the sexual assaults, the derogatory language thrown at them, It's a political commentary on how Indigenous people are treated, not just in Australia, but around the world. The difference is this show isn't afraid to treat the problem mostly unfiltered. It doesn't shy away from a lot of the atrocities committed. Auntie tells Cohen that he needs to step up and be the clever man. I really like this because a lot of superheroes don't have this problem. He has doubts about being the clever man, and it's awesome because Auntie and Waru both know what he needs to do, but they won't tell him how and let him figure it out for himself. We see flashes of his power, but never the brunt of his power. Near the end of the first season, the Zone is readying for war with the government. As the humans are leaving, a hairy person is shot by the police. All cops are bastards, even fictional ones. Non-hairy people have to make the decision to stay with the hairy people or to leave. Most leave, but some actually try to stay, including Alinta, Waru's daughter. Cohen and Waru arrive at Slade's lab. Slade welcomes both of them. Cohen attacks, but Slade has been taking the serum of hairy people, so he's strong and manages to knock out Cohen. Waru pulls a gun on him, but Slade explains he's a man of science. Waru accepts $30 million in exchange for the clever man staying with Slade. What, and I can't stress this enough, the fuck? The people of the Zone watch as the brothers defend them, but it's Cohen who sends the demon back as the clever man, even if he dies a time or two. In front of everyone, he comes into his own superpowers, and it's an excellent journey. Cohen feels good about it too, which is a nice plus, even if Slade is still alive. The series creator, Ryan Griffin, is Aboriginal himself, and he talked to elders to gather some stories to work with the series. It's riveting to watch just like Watchmen, but not for the same reason. Noah Berlansky writes, instead, Cleverman is riveting because it doesn't try to be that clever. Its science fiction dystopia functions almost exactly like the dystopia we live in. Indigenous people and Black people are segregated, policed, and imprisoned with no recourse. They are fetishized, sexually abused, and exploited. Their children are taken from them. They're forcibly assimilated. Slade is working on a scientific process that can turn hairy people into humans. This supposedly protects them from prejudice, though of course, ex-hairy people are still hated and no longer have the strength to defend themselves. It shows what's actually going on. We're in a dystopia, even if your parents and grandparents don't want to admit it. And there's no clear winner either. Berlansky points out that when you fight an entire society bent on hate and cruelty, any victory is provisional. And Cleverman brings something new to the table, just like Luke Cage did, heroes fighting systemic injustice. He also writes, the push for social realism in 1970s comics led to some heavy-handed moralizing, and while more recent titles like G. Willow Wilson's Miss Marvel have dealt with racial tension in a natural narrative way, they're still rare compared to hero stories that would rather trade strictly in fantasy face-offs. Superheroes are fearless about defeating evil scientists and planet-eating aliens. Confronted with systemic justice, the genre reacts as if it's been exposed to a fiendish variety of red kryptonite that forces it to scurry off to the nearest beach and bury its head in the sand. Berlansky continues, because the hairy people are indigenous, Cleverman's discussion of race and injustice is much more pointed and much more painful. Human treatment of the hairies isn't a speculative fantasy. It's simply an extension, and often not even an extension, of how indigenous people are treated. The hairies are forced to live in a ghetto side by side with other Black and indigenous people. They face constant police surveillance and harassment. For infractions, they're thrown in prison where they are humiliated and tortured. They're called subhuman and subjected to non-consensual medical experiments. Hairy women are fetishized and raped. Even supposed hairy people allies like Waru dream not of granting them freedom, but of assimilating them. The government wants to shave off the hairy's hair, reduce their strength, and turn them into copies of the superior humans who hate, persecute, and abuse them. These plots parallel the stolen generations and forced re-education of Native children to a degree that's barely subtext. And yes, it's a dystopian fantasy, but it's so thinly veiled that you can apply it to any minority group facing injustice right now. Black people, indigenous people, trans people, LGBTQ plus people, Latina people. It's not a secret that these groups are fighting for the things that cisgendered white people have: a home, job security, not to be killed because they breathe, basic fucking human decency. Cleverman doesn't have a problem with violence against police. Even Luke Cage was leery about doing that. Luke Cage's fight is with a black supervillain, and the black police are the ones shown as abusing black people themselves. In Cleverman, there's no such line. White against black, hairy people against non-hairy people. The show doesn't pussyfoot around the subject at all. And neither should we, because Cleverman highlights the systemic violence, the prejudice, the racism, and the genocide. It shows you can't just fix it with a superhero facing it down by himself. Part of the reason that Superman exists is because he can solve a lot of problems by himself, but that's a story for a later episode. Berlansky highlights the issue. The tomorrow of Cleverman is much like today, which means the dystopia for marginalized people has simply continued. More advanced communication technology and drones are used to keep tabs on people of color and target them more efficiently for imprisonment or death. Advanced genetic testing is used to separate normal people from those declared subhuman. Better weapons are used to more efficiently kill the same people that weapons are used to kill now. Progress doesn't mean more equality. It just means hating more effectively and building the ghetto walls higher. If you want to watch it, it's on Netflix and very excellent. But we should also take those lessons to heart and fight for injustice as a society and not let some Superman solve it for us. After all, Superman can die. And what will we do then?